Oh, thank you. Thanks. Good morning, everyone. Delighted everyone's here this morning. I always think it's a good option on Friday. Either everyone's really happy because the weekend's tomorrow, or it's been the end of a long week and this could be some further learning. So it's a bit of a balance. Good morning. My name is Paul McGuigan. I'm policy lead at SFHA and I lead on finance. And today's session is on the how-to guide to the rent setting tool. And I'm delighted to be joined by Kirsty Wells, the Director of Consultancy at Housemark, and also Jim Jervis, the Product Manager of Data Science at Housemark as well this morning. Before I pass over to Kirsty and Jim, I'd like to just do some housekeeping announcements this morning. So you'll have noticed that when you joined the session, your microphones are muted. And it's just to say that if you would like to speak, if you could ask your question directly, unmute yourself and say who you are and where you're from. And if you would prefer, there's also the chat option as well. We hope that you're comfortable being videoed this morning, but we realise that if you would like to turn your video off, that's fine as well. And we will share the recording after the webinar. So that's just everything from me in terms of just a quick introduction. I look forward to chatting with you a bit further as the presentation proceeds. The second half will be questions and answers, so we'll go into a bit more detail in terms of a Q&A. And I'd like to hand over to Kirsty to start the presentation. Thanks, Kirsty.
Okay, I'm now not sure if Jim or Karen are sharing the screen, but if somebody can share the screen, that would be great. Morning, everyone. As Paul said, I hope you're all looking forward to the weekend. The sun is shining in the borders at the moment. So what we thought we would do in conversation with SFHA is obviously give you all an update on the tool. So myself and Jim are here from Housemark to do that along with Paul. So if you could share the next slide, please, that would be great. So I think I wanted to start this morning by just saying, you know, when we built the tool with SFHA, and I've got a couple of slides just to remind people about where the tool came from, we never ever thought it would be the be all and end all of measuring affordability, and Jim will explain that with the data when we get to those slides. What we wanted it to be was a kind of exploratory tool that would give you some parameters of what affordability would look like when you're setting rents. And I think part of the challenge with that is defining affordability, as we know, is difficult. And Paul's going to come on to that with his slides. It's very subjective. And I think, you know, most of us working in the social housing sector can't afford a Tesla, no matter how much we would like one. So I just wanted to set the scene in terms of the tool is that exploratory tool. It should give you some sense of what's happening in the communities that you're working in around affordability with your rents. But we're not saying in terms of using this tool that you can be assured that every tenant living in one of your homes will find the rent affordable. So I think it's important just to set that out before Paul kind of goes into the history of affordability. So over to you, Paul.
Thank you. Thanks, Kirsty. Could I get the next slide, please, Karen? Thank you.
Oh, sorry, this is my slide.
Oh, sorry.
Sorry, God, we didn't rehearse very well. So I think, and so just on that basis about, you know, not every tenant necessarily feeling that rents are affordable, we know that obviously you as landlords are under pressure from the regulator and Scottish Government to ensure as much as possible that the rents that you charge are relating to the services and the quality of homes that you want to deliver, and that cycle is kind of ever perpetual, never ending, where you have to make decisions within your leadership teams and with your boards about rents and rent increases related to the types of services that you're delivering and the type of home that you want to deliver and build and maintain and retrofit, and all of those challenges that you face in terms of ensuring quality. And as a regulated sector, we know that, you know, we've got quality standards that have to be met, we've got regulations that have to be met, we've got potentially new building safety indicators coming. So you're constantly juggling that cycle of cost and quality and rents, and how does that play out in terms of affordability for tenants. So now I'll hand over to Paul. Sorry, Paul.
Thanks, Kirsty. Thank you. So as you can see that we have spent some time in the previous 3 decades defining affordability. So the SFHA first began to define affordability back in 1991, and as you can see, it published a twofold definition, which looked at a rent as being only affordable if no working household is obliged to pay more than 25% of its net income, including housing benefit on rent, and also no working household is left with less than 140% of the appropriate amount of income support. So this was the very first attempt at defining affordability, and it combined a two-pronged approach. So it looked at the income to rent ratio approach and also a residual income approach. Could I get the next slide, please, Karen? Thank you. So as you can see, in 1999, this moved on when an expert on affordability, Stephen Wilcox, published The Vexed Question of Affordability. I think it's still in print, and he explored a range of approaches, and he looked at the SFHA's approach on this at the time, but he had concerns with it. So SFHA then adopted a new measure based on housing benefit dependency. And this definition was, for a rent including service charges to be affordable, a household with one person working 16 hours or more should only exceptionally be dependent on housing benefit in order to pay for it. And this measure was incorporated into our guidance, which we published in 2001. But then 10 years later, we changed that to 35 hours or more when we produced the updated guidance, and we issued that to members. Could I get the next slide, please, Karen? Thank you. So you can see that there was another step change which took place in 2014. This was at the very early stages of universal credit coming in to replace housing benefit, and it introduced a series of changes. At the same time as this, we also had a data gap because there was an end of the production of the score data, which we used to assess the proportion of new tenants which were relying on housing benefit. And this led to a gap in the measures that we could use to check on affordability. So in that period in time, in the mid-2010s, there was a couple of years where we looked at a new moderate incomes approach to rent setting, and this was based on both affordability and sustainability. And this was a measure which looked at household type and variations in local incomes, but does not rely, importantly, on landlords having detailed information about their tenants. And this was then accompanied by the basic tool, which was then further developed by Housemark into the tool that we have today that we've shared with members, and we're going to look at in more detail. The latest developments on this, in 2021, the Scottish Government published its first ever long-term strategy, Housing to 2040. And within that, they gave a commitment to look at a definition of affordability. And this led to an affordability working group with Professor Ken Gibb at Glasgow University. So this group has met 4 times this year. And as I mentioned, it's looking to develop a shared understanding of affordability. We support this at SFHA, the overall direction of travel, because there's no agreed definition of affordability, but there is the expectation, as Kirsty indicated, from the regulator and also from the Scottish Government for rents to be affordable, and it has caused some confusion over the years. So we are committed to working with the working group to look at moving this issue forward. We expect them to report next year, but some of the things they've been looking at are the United Nations definition of affordability, which is affordability. Housing is not adequate if it costs, threatens or compromises the occupant's enjoyment of other human rights. And the working group is also looking at local authorities' definitions of affordability. So as you can see, they're taking a deep dive into the common terminology to look to come to a common definition, but we're still some way off. So this is where the tool and the work that Housemark and SFHA are doing in the interim is really important. I'd like to hand over to Jim now, and the next slide. Thanks, Karen. Thank you.
Oh, it's back to me, Paul.
Oh, sorry, Kirsty.
So just a refresher, because I know some of you might not have been around at the time that we developed the tool. So SFHA launched the tool in around 2017, and at the time the Excel tool was included in that Paul had on that slide. And in Housemark in Scotland, we have a member advisory board, and that has local authorities and housing associations on it. And at the time, Annette Finnan, who was the head of housing at South Lanarkshire Council, said it would be great if local authorities could access a rent affordability tool. Could Housemark build something similar? But you know yourselves, the sector's too small in Scotland to have 2 different affordability tools. So I approached Sally. Sally had just become a chief exec at SFHA, and we agreed that jointly we would develop the tool using Tableau, which we have staff, and Jim's one of those staff now who have got the skills to use Tableau. So it took a year to launch the tool because it was quite complex in terms of what we were trying to do with it, and that involved member working groups and road testing of that tool. And Shona Mitchell at the time was this SFHA policy lead who led on all of that work. So we got to 2018 and the tool went live on the back of that member involvement and member feedback. And as SFHA members, obviously you all have access to the tool, but the agreement with Housemark is that if there's local authorities in Scotland who are Housemark members, they also have access to the tool. And South Lanarkshire in particular have continued to use the tool on an annual basis with their tenant budget group. They have a budget group who look at rents every year. So it is available to those local authorities who are Housemark members as well. If you can move on to the next slide, please. So what does the tool contain? And this was the complexity in what we were trying to do in terms of making it something that would work for landlords. So we came up with 7 household types. So, tried to think about who's living in your homes. We then looked at 5 affordability comparisons. So if they have a certain amount of rent in their pocket, certain amount of income in their pocket, what is going to be affordable? And obviously in terms of all of that history that Paul's talking about in terms of rent affordability, things like percentage of income that goes towards rent, how many pounds are they left with after they've paid their rent, what does it look like in different local housing market areas in terms of the LHA rate. So all of those definitions were agreed as what we felt were appropriate affordability comparisons. And then with the income types, we came up with obviously things that you'll be familiar with, the real living wage, the average universal claimants at the time, the minimum wage as well for specific age groups. And then we looked at moderate incomes in terms of the annual survey of household earnings, which differs across the country, and there's different percentiles within the ASH definitions that you can use. And then that funny phrase, user inputted income, that's just a free text box where you can put in, if you were working with an individual tenant and they said to you, this is the amount of income I have a week, then you could type that into the tool. And then obviously we needed the average rents of social landlords. So that in Scotland, we're really lucky in terms of the business intelligence tool that SHR invested in when they developed the ARC and the charter. So all of that data is obviously open data and freely available. We do, following the developments with the SFHA, we then, Shona and I then worked with Community Housing Cymru in Wales, and we do have a Welsh rent affordability tool as well. And Jim's the person who each year has to work with CHC and try and influence Welsh Government to get data out of Welsh Government. And unfortunately, data quality and resources within Welsh Government is nothing like we're used to in Scotland in terms of the regulator. So I know each year it can be a bit of a pain to be getting your ARC returns in on time, but actually the data that is accessible to you and your organisations and more widely in the sector because of that is really important and unrivaled, I think, compared to other parts of the UK. Okay, if we can move on to the next slide, please. So just some terminology, as I said, annual survey of hours and earnings in terms of the ASH data, and that, as Paul highlighted, that was definitions around SFHA's development of the moderate income standard. Loughborough University also has the minimum income standard, and this was funded by JRF, and obviously Joseph Rowntree Foundation are sector leaders in terms of their narrative around poverty and affordability. So the minimum income standard is included within the tool as well. And then the real living wage, and obviously this week in the autumn statement, we've seen that government's committed to increase in living wage from April and for 21 and 22-year-olds as well. So the terminology will be familiar to you, I'm sure. We do have a guidance document as well that sits behind the actual Tableau tool, so you can see in more detail those definitions. But obviously the moderate income definition is one that SFHA were particularly keen to use. So if you can move to the next slide, please. Just some points to note here, and Jim will go into these in more detail when he goes through the tool. I think the important one there is the point around kind of what do the running costs look like in homes, and this was part of the debate when we developed the tool. If a tenant is saying their house isn't affordable, is it about rent or is it about other costs? And obviously in the last few years in particular, with the cost of living crisis, we know now it's not just about rents, it's about food, it's about fuel. And we knew all of that at the time, but the difficulty we had with the tool was what data is available to us that we can build into the tool. So we've put council tax data in because each local authority publishes obviously council tax bands, so you can add in that cost. But it's really difficult to account for the overall running costs of the house. So it's just, this is where, from a Housemark point of view, in terms of robust data, we would always say it's this exploratory tool, it's a modelling tool. It can give you some broad parameters, but it's not necessarily giving you, a defined detailed definitions of affordability. And then just in terms of local housing allowance, rates have been, in terms of how they operate, they relate obviously to broad rental market areas, but within the tool, they've been mapped to local authority level because we've used the GIS part of Tableau to put mapping in so that geographically you can see local authorities on the maps as well within the different tabs of the tool. If you can move on, please. So I'm going to just highlight a couple of things on the slides, but Jim is actually going to use the tool live just so people can see how it works. So I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with it now, but you can see the different tabs along the top. And when you go to the first page, before you get to this tab, the cover page, there is the link to the additional guidance there. So this is showing you Aberdeen City Council. I just alphabetically just picked the first local authority, and a proposed weekly rent of £160. I haven't put in any additional costs there or council tax, just kept it really simple at terms of the rent. It's a 3-apartment property, and the income is for a single parent with 2 children. And in the income drop down menu, I chose the 20th percentile for the annual survey, the ASH data. So it just lets you see there. I'll just talk through the different bits of that screen. The chart with the circles and the black line is so that there's a benchmarking element to the tool. So within the local authority area that you operate in, you can see the different housing associations operating. And again, that's based on ARC data. So obviously not for all of you in terms of community-based associations, but if you're working across multiple local authorities, you will appear in each of those local authorities from the drop-down menu. So if it's Hanover, for example, and you drop down and you choose Dundee City Council, you'll still see Hanover within that chart, but you'll see the likes of Hillcrest, Angus, that kind of thing. So it will change, but that was important in the discussions that we had about having that benchmarking element in, just so that you've got an easy, at a glance view of how your rents compare with other organisations. And you can see there, obviously Blackwood and Hanover are quite high in terms of that benchmark, and the specialist organisations will generally be higher because service charges are included. So that's something to remember about the SHR data, that it's rents and service charges together, and that will have an impact on the likes of Blackwood, Hanover, Trust, and I've missed one, Hanover, Trust, who's with Beeld, I forgot about Beeld. So when you put the data that you want to look at in the boxes across the top of the screen. In the right-hand side, the proposed weekly rent, and how that measures against the different types of affordability and income standards that we've put in, drops down there. And you can see that in terms of the proposed rent for the percentage of income that this family would be spending on a 3-apartment house in Aberdeen, it's around 33% of their income. And then the coloured charts at the bottom, again, Jim will demonstrate this, but you can kind of hover over them and it'll pull the data out for you. And that's just showing you the data that sits above that in the different rows, actually in table format below. I mean, obviously in Housemark, we talk a lot about data and how data is displayed. So that was why those charts were put into that screen as well. If you move on to the next slide, please. And again, you know, the tool is flexible, and Paul started a couple of months ago at SFHA, and I said to me, like, you won't break it, just play around with it, you know, you won't break it. And that's what I would encourage all of you to do. You know, all of those boxes where you can choose either the drop down menus or you can put in free text, then you won't break it. You know, you can play around with it as much as you like. I should just have highlighted as well the box that says on the right hand side, select household if average EC claim has been chosen. So in the income box where I've chosen the 20th percentile ASH, if you drop down that menu and select average EC claim, then in the 4th box along there, you would then choose what household type it is, so you can look at the average EC claim for that household type. So you can see there that by reducing the rent, obviously, I mean it's common sense, but obviously you can see there that the percentage of rent, of income that tenant would be spending on rent is reduced from 33% to 20%. So it really is about, like say, playing around with the tool, seeing what the data tells you, and not worrying about breaking it, because you won't. Karen, if you can move on to the next slide, please. And then living wage, as said, you know, in an earlier slide, the different income types are there. So again, we've just moved that income drop down to real living wage, and you can see what that looks like. We haven't changed the household makeup there. It's still a single parent with 2 children, but you can see there in terms of at £100 a week rent on the real living wage, what percentage of income would be getting used in terms of paying for rent. So you can model everything. You know, you can model people who are working, people who are not working, pensioners, different family types. It's all there in terms of the modeling that you can do. Next slide, please. And as said already, that's just making that bigger for you to see is that benchmarking option. So that might be something that you want to pull off in terms of reporting to board, or if you are working with active tenants in terms of tenant engagement, showing them how you compare within the geographical area that you operate. And obviously we've used SHR data for that, and we update the tool each year once the SHR data is out for the ARC returns at the end of September. So it's, you know, it's entirely up to you how you use it, but the opportunity is there for you to use that with stakeholders like your boards and your tenants. If you could have the next slide, please. And then just some of the other tabs that sit along the screen and the background tabs. So Jim will maybe have time to show you this working as well. You can hover over the map, and as you hover, each local authority area will kind of pop out and give you the data for that. So this is across a range of measures looking at affordability based on local authority area. And again, you can see at the bottom of the screen this time, the same kind of tabs are there. So if, for example, you wanted to compare council tax band across different local authority areas, the different figure would appear for each local authority. Obviously, where there's a national definition and it's not particular to local authorities, then it would appear in the same figure would appear for the whole of Scotland for each local authority. And generally, you know, that you can, again, Jim can show you this, but you can obviously filter in ascending or descending order. And as I've done there, you can hover over and you can pull out specific local authorities that you're looking at. So that pulled out Aberdeen City. So I don't know how useful, it'd be good to get feedback. I don't know how useful the kind of map option is, but obviously at the time the tool was developed, people wanted that, and Tableau has the functionality to do that. So we built that in. So I think I've maybe just got one more slide. So yeah, and I know that we had a question about this come in before this morning's session. Obviously, when you're looking at the data that comes out from SHR, so Jim updated the tool with the data that had been received from SHR for 22-23, and you're then looking to set rents now for 24-25. You can look at the rent that's come in from ARC, but you can also then look at the planned rent increases, so that you can obviously have to do some calculations, but you can combine the two and start to think about what that looks like for 24-25. So again, just staying within the Aberdeen City area, you can see there the different proposed rent increases that were submitted to the regulator by each organisation. So obviously the lowest there, Hanover at 3.9%, and the maximum, a few organisations settling for 6% increases. So I'll hand over to Jim now, and it's probably more useful to hear from Jim, but he'll let you see the functionality of the tool, excuse me, for those of you that are not familiar with using it, or you want a bit of a refresher on how to make the best use of it. So we're going to move out of PowerPoint and into the actual Tableau tool.
Lovely. Thanks, Kirsty. I'm just reminded of the advice about never doing live demos on presentations, but we'll see how this goes. Thanks for inviting me. I'm usually kind of hidden away doing stuff at the kind of the back end of things, so it's nice to sort of get a bit of exposure and talk about the tool in this case. As Kirsty outlined, it's relatively complex in the way that it's set up, the way that the data interacts with each other and the calculations. So I was trying to figure out how's the best way to sort of convey that. So I'm going to start by going from the end and almost working backwards. So let's see if this works. I'm going to share my screen. Has that worked?
Not yet, Jim. It might just take a couple of
I
seconds.
need to press the button that says share, don't I?
Yes, that's it, Jim. Thank you.
Okay, lovely. So hopefully you'll be kind of aware of this, or you've seen this. This is the tool. This is the landing page for the tool, but I'm going to go to the end, which is the last bit. And this is the bit that kind of typically I work on, which is the data sources. So this highlights the resources and the data that are built into the tool. And so it's helpful to understand where the data comes from, any context around the various data items, and because effectively you're doing lots of comparisons, and as Kirsty outlined, it's an explorative tool. So there are various options and various data sets that you can compare and make judgments. I suppose it's about you guys being able to make that judgment. There are about 10 separate inputs of data, and I update these throughout the year, so it's sort of staggered throughout the year. And the dates are highlighted in the tab, just to give you an idea of when they've been collected and when they apply to. And we did have a question about timescales and how to know, how to compare like with like and ensure the comparisons are fair. I suppose the short answer is that the tool's been designed as a way to interrogate and investigate the data, and give you guys likely scenarios to explore. It's not a prescriptive tool, and that you press a button, it tells you what the rent will be as such. As I say, it's about exploring and making a judgment. So I suppose the answer is you do need to make that judgment yourself a little bit and understand the context of the data and what it applies to. Typically, I will update the data when it comes available. Obviously, the autumn statement came out this week, so the national living wage is being uprated. At the moment, it's still looking at this financial year, but I can obviously put in the data for next year. But it's just an understanding of what you're comparing with. So ASH data is a sample survey from earlier in the year. I think that's from April and March. That matches relatively well with the rent data, because the rent data is 2023, but as Kirsty's explained, we do uprate that based on the proposed increases. Private rent data we get, that's from 2022. 2023's data is coming fairly soon, so they are all at slightly different periods. So it's just having that understanding, that awareness. That's why this tab's quite useful, so that you have the context, you know how to handle the data. So I'm going to jump from the back end to the front screen that Kirsty's already showed you the screenshots for. And this is where the bulk of the tool is. Obviously, there are other tabs. We'll maybe come onto those in a minute. And there are lots of options on here. It is quite confusing. So I'm just going to sort of talk through it in terms of the key output metrics. And these are affordability assessments. So there's the percentage of income, percentage of market rent, of local housing allowance, income after rent, and then income after rent above the minimum income standard. So there's 5 different metrics there. So the first one I'm going to talk about, the first 3 relate to income. So that's percentage of income, income after rent, and then income after rent above the minimum standard. And this is all predicated around these inputs here, so around the income types. So we provided, as Kirsty said, different possible incomes. So we can either model it around the earnings data from ASH, we can put in the minimum wage data, the real living wage data, or a typical universal credit claim. And lastly, you can put in whatever you want if you have, some local information that's more accurate than the model data effectively. That's the first part of the income calculation. The next part is around the household, and as part of the initial research that SFHA did, they developed a set of multipliers which effectively take that income for that person, and then depending on the size of the household, multiplies that. Or if it's someone working part-time, it will reduce the amount of income. So for each household type, there is a multiplier. So for a couple working full-time, it's double the amount, obviously, but then for families, there are different types of multipliers. So that gives you your income, and then aligned with that up here are costs that Kirsty's already talked about. Specifically here, we picked up council tax because it's a data set that is uniform across Scotland. It's quite easy to put into the tool because it's not specific to particular areas or to particular housing associations. There is also an option to put in any other extra cost that you can think of that maybe fall out the side of the modelling. So you can enter that as free text. So once you've got the income, once you've put in the costs, then it's a case of, well, how does that relate to income? So the first measure is percentage of income. So I've put in a proposed rent of £100 here. So it looks at the income, it looks at the costs, and then works out. It's roughly about a quarter of income is spent on rent. For an absolute affordability value, then we can look at the amount of income after rent. So how much income have you got left once you've paid that proposed rent? So in this case for Aberdeen, again, just because it's alphabetical, I could choose another one. Let's choose some Dundee. Obviously, it'll update according to the local authority that's been chosen. This is the absolute amount after rent, and then interestingly, this is the same affordability metric as the one above, but then we apply the minimum income standard. Now, as Kirsty outlined, this is research that's done annually by the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, and it's useful in that this is the only part of the tool that pulls in information around the cost of living. So it pulls in some of those inflationary cost lines. So things particularly like groceries, food and domestic fuel costs. And what you'll notice here is that it's a negative. So what we're saying here is actually there is no headroom, or there's a minus £61 sort of deficit for a proposed weekly rent of £100. So it's quite an interesting metric, and there was a delegate, as one of the questions we had this week was around the fact that for the examples that they were trying, it was impossible to come up with a rent that was affordable using the minimum income standard. And so I did a bit of a dig into that and to look at the figures, and the reason for that is that income has increased. I think it was about 11 or 12% over 2 years, but the minimum income standard has shot up by almost 44%. So there's been a huge impact, and we're all aware of the fact that fuel costs, groceries have increased hugely. So there's a bit of a mismatch now. It doesn't mean that the tool's incorrect. It does make it more difficult to make that assessment with the minimum income standard, but it's worth pointing out that I think even the annual report from the JRF, they talk about how difficult it is now for families to even reach the minimum income standard. So it's a valid metric, and it just points to how much inflation has hit certain parts of of people's sort of typical costs. So those are the income measurements. There's also a couple of kind of relative assessments that don't rely on income but look at the wider market. So then we can compare the rent against the local housing allowance rate, as well as the typical kind of market rent. So what does it look like in the wider housing sector, and how do you compare? And obviously, depending on bed size and local authority you choose, you'll get different results from that. So there's quite a lot in there. As I said, it's very much an explorative tool, because you could choose any one of those metrics and then make a judgment for yourself of what seems acceptable and build a picture. And I suppose it's for you to help build that narrative rather than say, yes, this is the perfect rent for you, because obviously that's not a feasible way of doing it. There's a load more in the tool. I mean, these charts down here, rather than looking at proposed rents, these look at the SHR rents and just say, well, how well are you doing against those affordability metrics at the moment across that particular local authority for each of these housing associations. So that's another quite interesting benchmark. There's obviously the benchmark, the chart in the central part of the page, which looks at your peers within that local authority, what they're currently charging in terms of rent. So there are lots of ways you can approach this. But that was kind of how I wanted to try and break down the tool and make it as straightforward as possible. As Kirsty says, there are other tabs. These primarily are just taking components from the affordability assessments and just splitting them down by theme almost. So you can start to look at what are the income, some of those, the income data, what does that look like across Scotland, across the local authorities in Scotland. And you can choose different income types. Look at ASH, you could look at minimum wage, you can look at a typical universal credit claim, and then it'll update the map accordingly. And then there's the same for the rent component. So at the moment it's looking at the SHR data, but you could also look at what that looks like in terms of market rents. How does that differ? And then lastly, there's affordability, which is kind of the culmination of these various components. So those 5 affordability assessments, sorry, these ones, you can choose a different one. I mean, it's always interesting to look at the income after rent above minimum standard, because I suspect everything's in the red now, because as I say, because of those huge inflationary increases, every local authority, well, East Renfrewshire and East Dunbartonshire have a tiny bit of headroom for 1 beds, but some are really struggling in terms of those inflationary increases. I think that's kind of it for me for the tool. As Kirsty says, you really get the most from it in kind of playing with it. And one thing that became apparent to me in trying to pull this together is actually you guys probably have more experience of using this tool than I do, because I plug the data in the back end. I don't really play around with it too much and get the output. So we would welcome any feedback and any questions. So I'll throw it back to Paul, or maybe to the wider group to